Hi there. In this chapter, you're going to be introduced to some of the more fascinating animals found around the world and even in your own backyard. These are the amphibians. This group of vertebrates are diverse morphologically, they're ecologically fascinating, and they're very important in many of the ecological communities that they live in. They're also facing a pretty uncertain future, and we'll get to that later in this chapter. There are three groups of amphibians. They're relatively easy to tell apart, and let's take a quick look at these difference of these three groups, or sometimes now called clades, or you may have heard them called orders. The first group of amphibians grow up and have no tail. They're simply called frogs or aenurans. Don't be confused with what you might have learned early on or heard about people using the sentence that includes something like frogs and toads as if these were equal terms. But they're not. All toads are frogs because they're amphibians that grow up without a tail. Not all frogs are toads, but all toads are frogs. The second group are sort of the opposite. If they grow up and have a tail, these amphibians are known as salamanders. Similar issue that you may have heard about in the past with a sentence that says newts and salamanders, as if these terms were equal, just like the frogs and toads. These are not. All newts are salamanders because, as adults, they're amphibians and they have a tail. All newts are salamanders, but not all salamanders are newts. Newts are just one family of salamanders, even around here. The mud puppies, fully aquatic, are another family of salamanders. The lungless salamanders are another family of salamanders around here. So if you were an amphibian that has a tail as an adult, you're simply called a salamander or the caudata. This last group of amphibians are easily told, although we don't know much about them because they're basically found in the tropics. They are only maybe 150 to 200 species. They're not very common. Many of them are fossorial, that is to say they live underground. A few of them are fully aquatic. We don't know much about them, but the simplest way to identify these amphibians is they have no limbs at all. And these are not worms, they're not snakes, although the picture might suggest that. These are simply amphibians without any legs at all. Amphibians, like all these other groups, are vertebrates. They have bones, including a backbone, and there's lots of vertebrates in the world, although not as many as there are invertebrates, as we've already looked at, but still, these are the animals that most of us are familiar with. Let's take a look at their numbers, their biological diversity. Fishes are the most abundant of all the vertebrates. There's about 23,000 species in the world. They are incredibly fascinating. They have a long geologic history. They are found in virtually all aquatic systems on the planet: warm water, cold water, coastal areas, ponds and lakes, even pools of water, streams, rivers. Fishes are incredibly abundant. Reptiles, about 10,500 species. I've put the reptile word in quotes because the term reptile now has to include birds that historically have been separated but really are part of it. But I'm going to separate out the birds here just like your book does, and we'll explain that in the lecture more often in more detail. The reptiles, though, without the birds, there's about 10,500 species. These include the lizards and snakes, the turtles, crocodilians, the tuataras from New Zealand. They are an incredibly diverse group of animals, and you're probably familiar with them around your own homes. Birds, that subgroup of reptiles, if we separated them out, there's about 10,000 species of birds in the world. These are modern-day feathered reptiles. Think of them that way. And we'll learn more about their evolution and historic place in the chapters coming up. The next group of vertebrates are the mammals, including us. They're among the most recently evolved of all the vertebrates. There's about 5,000 different kinds of mammals or species in the world that we know of. A few are found every year, a couple of new ones every year, but we pretty much know virtually all the mammals that are found in the world. But what about the amphibians? These are the first tetrapods, the first vertebrates with limbs to have evolved onto the land, where there was an incredible number of ecological communities available to them, superb amount of food in the form of insects and other invertebrates, lots of places for them to breed and reproduce and put their eggs, lots of different places to go, and amphibians were the first ones to conquer the land, first vertebrates, that is. Today, there's still about 6,000 species. There's more amphibians on the planet today than there are mammals, at least for now. Their numbers are declining. So what else is there in this chapter? An awful lot. The whole chapter is only a dozen pages or so I'd like you to take a look at the whole thing. It'll take us a couple of days to get through this chapter, partly because I'm really fascinated by amphibians. They're more familiar to you than most other groups of animals, and so we're going to spend a little bit of time on it. But you should read all of chapter 17 before our first class, and we will go into some details that are in the book and a few that are not. So thanks for listening to this introduction. Let's take a look at the amphibians.